A Fire Upon the Deep by Vernor Vinge. So this book was copyright 1992 and it won the Hugo Award for Best Novel in 1993. And here on the cover we have artwork by Boris Vallejo, and I believe this is a depiction of the relay, which is a kind of a large part of this book. At first I thought it was a spaceship, but I don't know. I'm thinking that it's the relay. There's a spaceship here on the side. Maybe if you have some insight on this, you can comment. But this is a great book. I loved almost everything about it. It had been on my to-read list for a really long time. But it's a hard one to kind of talk about without giving too much away. So I'm going to first talk about the universe, the zones of thought, that idea, and then some of the alien species real briefly before I get into the plot. And this is a book that's kind of part of a 3-book trilogy. It's the first book. The second book is called Deepness in the Sky, and I believe this is a kind of prequel with one of the main characters that's in here. And the third book, I'm not exactly sure what that one's about yet. But in the beginning of the book, he has this picture he drew about, and this is the Milky Way galaxy and how he kind of envisions these zones of thought to work. And basically you have this unthinking depth at the center of the Milky Way galaxy, and there's only certain levels of technology and thinking that can work down here, and it's very primitive. If you were, the way it's described, if you were in the slow zone, which is the adjacent zone above that, if you were to go down into these unthinking depths like in a spaceship, you would be kind of lost there forever because you wouldn't really have the mental thinking power or the technology to come back. And no one could really even go down there and try to retrieve you either, because as soon as they enter that zone, they would kind of be lost as well. Next we have the slow zone. This is where Earth's at. This zone is bound by the speed of light for communication, for travel. There's kind of just talked about briefly. Most of the story doesn't take place in this zone, but it's kind of implied that there's just certain levels of technology and thinking that you just kind of reach this cap where you can't go beyond that. And then next you'd get into the beyond. Most of this novel is taking place in the beyond. And this zone, there is faster than light travel, there's faster than light communication, there's more alien species that are in this area. Humans have entered this area and kind of expanded their technology and possibly their minds. And then above that, it's not really shown in that artist's depiction. And you can go online and see this. If you just Google Vernor Vinge, Fire Upon the Deep, Zones of Thought, you'll get a picture of that you can pull up on your screen and probably zoom in a little bit better. But there's this area above that called the Transcend. And this is, the way it's described, it's more like a spirit realm or like these godlike entities that have evolved and moved up the ranks and got to that state where they've completely left physical reality behind almost, and they're in that, you know, the top zone. And so now I want to talk about a couple of the alien species. There's the main alien species that's talked about in this book they're called the Tines, and they're a dog-like creature that have this very unique pack-like mentality. And I don't really want to describe them too much. It is confusing, and I'll get into that later. But the way Vernor wrote this, I think you need to be confused. You need to trust him that he will explain how they operate as you go through the story. And all the way, I think even in the epilogue, he's still throwing out some little tidbits of how these Tines operate. But if you knew exactly everything about them and how they operate before you started reading this, I personally think it would kind of spoil some of the discovery aspect of the book, how they work. It might even spoil some of the plot because you would know right away what's going on. And I think it's purposely written like that to have you learn more and more, because he's not going to do a lot of info dumps in this book, and that's another great thing about this book. There's also these aliens called the Scrode Riders, and they're like a plant-like entity with these fronds. And at some point a long time ago, and I think another alien species helped them out and gave them these like kind of hovercraft. You know, they ride these things. It's almost like a vehicle. And not only does it help them move around in space, but it also helps with some of their mental deficiencies that they have. They kind of lack short-term memory. And so it kind of helped with that a little bit. And so they're another kind of focal alien species in this book. And then it's also talked about, there's like millions of different alien species in this universe or this galaxy. And there's a couple others that are briefly talked about, but those are kind of the two main ones. And I think talking about them a little here first is going to help when we get into the plot of this book. So, as vast and ambitious and deep as this universe sounds, and all these different aliens and everything like that, the actual story and plot of the book is kind of tight and zoomed in onto this one little area of the galaxy here, and it's shown in this picture. There's this little box here, and then here's a blown up area of it. And this shows kind of the main planets, the relay, and where all of our characters are kind of operating in this novel. So as big as that sounds, you get a pretty good tight plot to focus on, and it keeps you from kind of, blowing up your head trying to think about too much. So let's just get into the plot. And I'm going to talk about the plot briefly. I really want to encourage people to read this if you haven't. And I don't really want to spoil too much. I really just kind of want to tease and get you into it. And then, of course, there's some pros and cons, but we'll get into that later. So now let's just get into the plot of this book. So in the beginning, we have some humans that were out exploring, and they discovered this kind of artifact. And when they discovered this thing, they kind of unknowingly awoke an entity. Later, we'll come to find out it was called the Blight, and it was very dangerous and starts spreading throughout this area of this beyond that they're in, this zone of thought. They figured this out pretty quick, and some of them were able to escape. And we have a family, basically, a mom and a dad and 2 kids. And they also have some cargo that I won't really talk about too much. And they ended up getting away from this blight before it kind of encompasses them. And they were traveling, and they ended up crash landing on a planet. And this planet is where these creatures called the Tines were. And these alien species, these Tines, they had never really had any outside exposure from any other humans or aliens. They were living in this kind of medieval state where they have castles, they're using knives and bow and arrows. They're at war amongst themselves. They have their own political thing going on. And this ship crash lands on their planet, and they don't know what's going on. There ends up being kind of a little bit of a battle, and it might sound spoiler, but this happens pretty early on. The parents are killed, and the 2 children are taken, one by each faction, and both of these children don't really know that the other one's alive. They think that they're the only one that survived off of this ship. So that kind of sets up that plot line. Now, the other plot line, we have a relay station, and these relays are very important for traveling through different parts of of the galaxy that are kind of in between worlds, and they're also huge in passing information through the galaxy. And there's the way he talks about this information and this net is just really interesting, because this book was written in 1992, before the internet that we are used to now. But, you know, back then there were these news groups and chat rooms and things like that. And Vernor really kind of took that idea and blossomed it into a galaxy expanding net of basically a lot of individual chatting about things, and they call it the net of a million lies. There's so much information. They talk about just having indexes on top of indexes on top of indexes just to try to weed the information out, and what's real, what's true, what's false, what's been, you know, purposely thrown out there as disinformation. So that idea was really cool. But we have a main character named Ravna, who's kind of as an intern, a human intern on this relay station, and she's basically the only human. There's a bunch of other alien species, and they kind of catch wind of this issue that happened, this blight that was awoken, this ship that got away, and some of them were able to escape right before the relay station is overtaken by the blight and kind of just destroyed. And so they know that there's a possible solution to this blight, this artifact that these people were able to get away with. And so some of these members that were left of this relay outpost start traveling towards this planet that they know the ship crashed on, this Tynes world. So another thing that needs mentioning, I think, is this character named Pham. And he was picked up around this relay plot thread, and he is very unique. It's kind of vague exactly what he is. Could be kind of this clone hybrid computer thing that was cobbled together by one of these godlike entities to kind of help attack this blight. And he's just a very unique character. He's sort of human, but not quite. And Vernor just did an amazing job writing this character. And there's just this, you know, mystique around him. You're not quite sure, but he's involved with some of the other characters. He's very integral to the plot, and also just a fascinating character that Vernor imagined. The whole story is basically these two storylines coming together and eventually meeting and then resolving this whole conflict. So that's a plot line. I'm going to leave it at that. We'll go ahead and get into some pros and cons. For pros, Vernor's world building and the way he can describe aliens and create unique aliens. It doesn't just feel like he took a humanoid and just kind of changed a few things. Like, he actually describes very interesting nuances and differences and completely alien ideas into these creatures and these aliens. And it's just amazing. If anything, you can read these books just for that imagination. And it's done really well. You know, these zones of thought, they're probably not real, of course, but it's just a unique concept there too, that anything has certain caps depending on where they are in the galaxy, and to ascend you have to kind of keep going up, and you can eventually maybe reach a godlike state. So that's all really cool. The plot of this book was really good too. It was engaging. It kept you reading because it is a thick book. It's over 600 pages, and it did keep me moving along, just always wanting to know what's going on with the plot and what's going on with some of these alien creatures, because he doesn't explain them all in the beginning, like I said. And so you have to keep reading to understand things that happen earlier in the book. and it kind of like the revelations and the ideas kind of come to you as you read through it. So great job there. For cons, there were a couple areas that slogged for me a bit. Even as much as I like these Tyne creatures, he spends a lot of time talking about their kind of warring factions and everything that's going on amongst them while they have these two human children with them. The second part of the book even drags on to me a little bit. There was some times where I wasn't really excited to pick up the book and read these long chapters that could take 30 minutes to an hour, when I knew kind of right up front what I was getting into. It felt like work a little bit during some of those. But it was only kind of in the second half of the book, and then towards the end it kind of started resolving itself again and kind of speeding up. And you get towards the end of the book and there's so many things that haven't been kind of resolved, and you're wondering if they're going to get resolved, and then very quickly at the end there's this kind of abrupt ending. So I wish that, just this is my ideas or my thoughts, but I wish the pacing in the second half would have been a little less of the Tynes and everything that was going on there, and a little bit more resolving the conclusion. But that's just me. Overall, this book is not quite probably a 5-star read for me. As much as I say I like this, there was just a few things missing. The pacing and the characters were good, but there is a negative about the way these Tynes operate in my mind, and I don't really want to talk about them too much. Like I said, it spoils some of it, but you can't, it's hard to get invested in them as a character because of the way they operate. I'll put it that way. But overall, I would recommend this to anybody that's probably been exposed to some science fiction, that's willing to read a 600-page big space opera, and who wants to really have some great world building and these alien civilizations just completely detailed out. I don't think I've seen anything done better really in one 600-page novel. So really good. I don't think I'm going to go straight into Deepness in the Sky. These books take a lot of brain power. Kind of disconnected from the plot and everything since it is a prequel. So I figure I could probably pick this up at another time and kind of space myself out. This thing is like, 700 and some pages. So the next book on the list that I'm going to read is This Is the Way the World Ends by James Morrow. He is kind of, I don't know if you call him obscure. He wrote a little bit in science fiction, and then from what I can tell, he's written some of these kind of religious fiction books that are kind of fantasy, kind of science fiction. But it just sounds real interesting, and I'm going to give this one a go next. So that's all for this video. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.